Henrietta Chapter 6, Making War and Republican Governments. 1776 to 1789. Identify the big idea. How revolutionary was the American Revolution? What political, social, and economic changes did it produce, and what stayed the same? When patriots in Frederick County, Maryland, demanded his allegiance to the cause in 1776, Robert Gassaway would have none of it. It was better for the poor people to lay down their arms and pay the duties and taxes laid upon them by the king and parliament than to be brought back into slavery and commanded and ordered about by you, he told them. The story was much the same in Farmington, Connecticut, where patriot officials imprisoned Nathaniel Jones and 17 other men for remaining neutral. In Pennsylvania, Quakers accused of loyalism were rounded up, jailed, and charged with treason, and some were hanged for aiding the British cause. Everywhere the outbreak of fighting in 1776 forced families to choose the loyalist or patriot side. The Patriots' control of most local governments gave them an edge in this battle. Patriot leaders organized militia units and recruited volunteers for the Continental Army, a ragtag force that surprisingly held its own in the battlefield. I admire the American troops tremendously, exclaimed a French officer. It is incredible that soldiers composed of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, almost naked, unpaid, and rather poorly fed, can march so well and withstand fire so steadfastly. Military service created political commitment, and vice versa. Many patriot leaders encouraged Americans not only to support the war, but also to take an active role in government. As more people did so, their political identities changed. Previously, Americans had lived within a social world dominated by the links of family, kinship, and locality. Now the abstract bonds of citizenship connected them directly to more distant institutions of government. From subjects to citizens, the difference is immense, remarked South Carolina patriot David Ramsey. By repudiating monarchical rule and raising a democratic army, the Patriots launched the age of Republican revolutions. Soon, republicanism would throw France into turmoil and inspire revolutionaries in Spain's American colonies. The independence of the Anglo-American colonies, remarked the Venezuelan political leader Francisco de Miranda, who had been in New York and Philadelphia at the end of the American Revolution, was bound to be the infallible preliminary to our own independence movement. The Patriot Uprising of 1776 set in motion a process that gradually replaced an Atlantic colonial system that spanned the Americas with an American system of new nations. Teaching tip: as students read this chapter, have them keep a chart of political, social, and economic continuities and changes during the war. At the end of the chapter, have them use these notes to answer the big idea question. Teaching tip: students are often confused by the meaning of republicanism. Review the term in the context of the American Revolution as students are beginning their reading and discussion of the chapter. The Trials of War, 1776 to 1778. The Declaration of Independence appeared just as the British launched a full-scale military assault. For 2 years, British troops manhandled the Continental Army. A few inspiring American victories kept the rebellion alive, but during the winters of 1776 and 1777, the Patriot cause hung in the balance. Once the British resorted to military force, few Europeans gave the rebels a chance. The population of Great Britain was 11 million, the colonies 2.5 million, 20% of whom were enslaved, Africans. Moreover, the British government had access to the immense wealth generated by the South Atlantic system in the emerging Industrial Revolution. Britain also had the most powerful navy in the world, a standing army of 48,000 Britons, plus thousands of German Hessian soldiers, and the support of thousands of American loyalists and powerful Indian coalitions. In the Carolinas, the Cherokees resisted colonist demands for their lands by allying with the British, as did 4 of the 6 Iroquois nations of New York. In the Ohio country, Shawnees and their allies, armed by the British, attacked the new Kentucky settlement. By contrast, the Americans were economically and militarily weak. They lacked a strong central government and a reliable source of tax revenue. Their new Continental Army, commanded by General George Washington, consisted of 18,000 poorly trained and inexperienced recruits. To demonstrate Britain's military superiority, the Prime Minister, Lord North, ordered General William Howe to capture New York City. His strategy was to seize control of the Hudson River and thereby isolate the radical patriots in New England from the colonies to the south. As the Second Continental Congress declared independence in Philadelphia in July of 1776, Howe landed 32,000 troops, British regulars and German mercenaries, outside of New York City. In August of 1776, Howe defeated the Americans in the Battle of Long Island and forced their retreat to Manhattan Island. There, Howe outflanked Washington's troops and nearly trapped them. Outgunned and outmaneuvered, the Continental Army again retreated, eventually crossing the Hudson River to New Jersey. By December, the British Army had pushed the rebels across New Jersey and over the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. From the Patriots' perspective, winter came just in time. Following 18th century custom, the British halted their military campaign for the cold months, allowing the Americans to catch them off guard. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington crossed the Delaware River and staged a successful surprise attack on Trenton, New Jersey, where he forced the surrender of 1,000 German soldiers. In early January 1775, the Continental Army won a small victory at nearby Princeton, but these minor triumphs could not mask British military superiority. "These are the times," wrote Thomas Paine, "that try men's souls." Armies and strategies. Thanks in part to General Howe, the rebellion survived. Howe had opposed the coercive acts of 1774 and still hoped for a political compromise. So he did not try to destroy the American army, but instead tried to show its weakness and persuade the Continental Congress to give up the struggle. Howe's restrained tactics cost Britain the opportunity to nip the rebellion in the bud. For his part, Washington acted cautiously to avoid a major defeat. "On our side, the war should be defensive," he told Congress. His strategy was to draw the British away from the seacoast, extend their lines of supply, and sap their morale. Congress had promised Washington a regular force of 75,000 men. But the Continental Army never even reached a third of that number. Yeomen refused to be harassed with call-outs that took them away from their families and farms, would serve only in local militias. When the Virginia gentry imposed a military draft and 3 years of service on the propertyless men, the lazy fellows who lurk about are pests of society. They resisted so fiercely that the legislature had to pay them substantial bounties and agreed to shorter terms of service. The Continental soldiers recruited in Maryland by General William Smallwood were poor American youths and older foreign-born men, often British ex-convicts and former indentured servants. Most enlisted for the $20 cash bonus, about $2,000 today, and the promise of 100 acres of land. Teaching tip: as students examine map 6.1, have them account for the geographic distribution of support for the two sides. Why were certain areas more likely to support the Loyalist or Patriot side? Why did the majority of Native Americans support the Loyalist side? To help students visualize the military course of the war, have them examine the interactive map on the American War for Independence. edcitement.neh.gov. Alright, teaching tips. Students sometimes have difficulty understanding the radical Whig ideology. A good short article that discusses the concept as it relates to the American Revolution and the early Republic is Peter Malowski, Understanding the Creation of U.S. Armed Forces, Foreign Policy Research Institute, footnote 12, FRPI, whatever. Alright. Molding, identify causes. What factors made it difficult for the Continental Congress to create an effective army? Molding such recruits into an effective fighting force was nearly impossible. Inexperienced soldiers panicked in the face of British attacks. Thousands deserted, unwilling to submit to the discipline of military life. The soldiers who stayed resented the contempt their officers had for camp followers, women who made do with the meager supplies provided to feed and care for troops. General Philip Schuyler of New York complained that his troops were destitute of provisions, without camp equipage, and little ammunition, and not a single piece of cannon. The Continental Army was not only poorly supplied, but also held in suspicion by radical Whig patriots who believed that a standing army was a threat to liberty. Even in wartime, they preferred militias to a professional fighting force. Given these handicaps, Washington and his army were fortunate to have escaped an overwhelming defeat. Victory at Saratoga. After Howe failed to achieve an overwhelming victory, Lord North and his colonial secretary, Lord George Germain, launched another major military campaign in 1777. Isolating New England remained the primary goal. To achieve it, Germain planned a three-pronged attack, converging on Albany, New York. General John Burgoyne would lead a large contingent of regulars south from Quebec. Colonel Barry, St. Leger, and a force of Iroquois would attack from the west, and General Howe would lead troops north from New York City. Howe instead decided to attack Philadelphia, the home of the Continental Congress, hoping to end the rebellion with a single blow. But instead of marching quickly across New Jersey, Howe loaded his troops onto boats and sailed up the Chesapeake Bay to attack Philadelphia from the south. The plan worked. Howe's troops easily outflanked the American positions along Brandywine Creek in Delaware, and in late September marched triumphantly into Philadelphia. However, the capture of the rebels' capital did not end the uprising. The Continental Congress, determined to continue the struggle, fled to the countryside. Howe's slow campaign against Philadelphia contributed to the defeat of Burgoyne's army at Saratoga. Burgoyne's troops had first advanced quickly, overwhelming the American defenses at Fort Ticonderoga in early July and driving south toward the Hudson River. Then they stalled. Burgoyne, nicknamed Gentleman Johnny, was used to high living and had fought in Europe in a leisurely fashion, believing his army would easily dominate the rebels. He stopped early each day to pitch comfortable tents and eat elaborate dinners with his officers. The American troops, led by General Horatio Gates, also slowed Burgoyne's progress by felling huge trees in his path and raiding British supply lines to Canada. At summer's end, Burgoyne's army of 6,000 British and German troops and 600 Loyalists and Indians was stuck near Saratoga, New York. Desperate for food and horses in August, the British raided nearby Bennington, Vermont, but were beaten back by 2,000 American militiamen. Patriot forces in the Mohawk Valley also threw St. Leger and Iroquois into retreat. Making matters worse, the British commander in New York City recalled 4,000 troops he had sent toward Albany and ordered them to Philadelphia to bolster Howe's force. While Burgoyne waited in vain for help, thousands of Patriot militiamen from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New York joined Gates, blocking Burgoyne in a series of skirmishes that finally gave the British no avenue of escape. The Patriots swarmed around the army like birds of prey, reported an English sergeant, and in October of 1777, they forced Burgoyne to surrender. The victory at Saratoga was the turning point of the war. The Patriots captured more than 5,000 British troops and ensured the diplomatic success of American representatives in Paris, who won a military alliance with France. The perils of war. The Patriots' triumph at Saratoga was tempered by wartime difficulties. A British naval blockade cut off supplies of European manufacturers and disrupted the New England fishing industry. Meanwhile, the British occupation of Boston, New York, and Philadelphia reduced trade. As Patriots, along with unemployed artisans and laborers, moved to the countryside, New York City's population declined from 21,000 to 10,000. The British blockade cut tobacco exports in the Chesapeake, so planters grew grain to sell to the contending armies. All across the land, farmers and artisans adapted to a war economy. With goods now scarce, governments requisitioned military supplies directly from the people. In 1776, Connecticut officials asked the citizens of Hartford to provide 1,000 coats and 1,600 shirts, and soldiers echoed their pleas. After losing all his shirts except the one on my back in the Battle of Long Island, Captain Edward Rogers told his wife that the making of cloth must go on. Patriot women responded in Elizabeth, New Jersey. They promised upwards of 100,000 yards of linen and woolen cloth. Other women assumed the burdens of farm work while their men were away at war and acquired a taste for decision-making. "We have sowed our oats as you desired," Sarah Cobb Payne wrote to her absent husband. "Had I been master, I should have planted it to corn." Their self-esteem boosted by wartime activities, some women expected greater legal rights in the new Republican society. Still, goods remained scarce and pricey. Hard-pressed consumers assailed shopkeepers as enemies, extortioners, and monopolizers, and called for government regulation. But when New England states imposed price ceilings in 1777, many farmers and artisans refused to sell their goods. Ultimately, a government official admitted consumers had to pay the higher market prices or submit to starving. Here we go. Teaching tip, back on Saratoga. Nope, that was not it. The PBS series Liberty, the American Revolution provides an overview of the conflict from the earliest tensions between the colonies and Great Britain through the creation of the Constitution. Episode 3 and 4 deal with both the Patriot victory at Saratoga and the struggles facing the Continental Army in the middle years of the war. American militiamen. Beset by the continuing shortages of cloth, the Patriot Army dressed in a variety of uniforms and fabrics. The German engraving taken from a drawing by a Hessian officer shows two American militiamen, one of them barefoot, wearing hunting shirts and trousers made of ticking, the strong linen fabric often used to cover mattresses and pillows. Alright, here we go. Teaching tips, a site with several good links to documents and teaching ideas about Loyalists and the American Revolution. apcentral.collegeboard.com. Teaching tip, Washington, 1777, letter from Valley Forge calling for more supplies is available at gilderham.org. American Revolution is a good place to explore ways in which American diplomats took advantage of European rivalries, particularly those between Britain and France, to attain their goals. Introduce the concepts of idealism and realism and ask students to which term they would use to characterize American diplomacy during the period. The fighting endangered tens of thousands of civilians. A British officer, Lord Rawdon, favored giving free liberty to the soldiers to ravage the country at will, that these infatuated creatures may feel what a calamity of war is. As British and American armies marched back and forth across New Jersey, they forced Patriot and Loyalist families to flee their homes to escape arrest or worse. Soldiers and partisans looted farms and disorderly troops harassed and raped women and girls. An army, even a friendly one, are a dreadful scourge to any people, wrote one Connecticut soldier. You cannot imagine what devastation and distress mark their steps. The war divided many farm communities. Patriots formed committees of safety to collect taxes and seize the property of those who refused to pay. Everybody submitted to our sovereign lord the mob, lamented Loyalist preacher. In parts of Maryland, the number of non-associators, those who refused to join either side, was so large that they successfully defied Patriot mobs. "Stand off, your damned rebels, sons of bitches," shouted Robert Davies of Anne Arundel County. "I will shoot you if you come any nearer." Such defiance exposed the weakness of Patriot governments. Most states were afraid to raise taxes, so officials issued bonds to secure gold or silver from wealthy individuals. When those funds ran out, individual states financed the war by issuing so much paper money, some $260 million all told, that it lost worth, and most people refused to accept it at face value. In North Carolina, even tax collectors eventually rejected the state's currency. The finances of the Continental Congress collapsed too, despite the efforts of Philadelphia merchant Robert Morris, the government's chief treasury official. Because the Congress lacked the authority to impose taxes, Morris relied on funds requisitioned from states, but the states paid late or not at all. So Morris secured loans from France and Holland and sold Continental loan certificates to some 13,000 firms and individuals. All the while, the Congress was issuing paper money, some 200 million between 1776 and 1779, which, like state currencies, quickly fell in value. In 1778, a family needed $7 in Connecticut bills to buy goods worth $1 in gold or silver. As the exchange rate deteriorated to 42 to 1, in 1779, 100 to 1 in 1780, and 146 to 1 in 1781, it sparked social upheaval. In Boston, a mob of women accosted merchant Thomas Boylston, seized him by his neck, and forced him to sell his wares at traditional prices. In rural Ulster County, New York, women told the Committee of Safety to lower food prices, or their husbands and sons shall fight no more. As morale crumbled, Patriot leaders feared the rebellion would collapse. Valley Forge. Fears reached their peak during the winter of 1777. While Howe's army lived comfortably in Philadelphia, Washington's army retreated 20 miles to Valley Forge, where 12,000 soldiers and hundreds of camp followers suffered horribly. The army now begins to grow sickly, a surgeon confided to his diary. Poor food, hard lodging, cold weather, fatigue, nasty clothes, nasty cookery. Why are we sent here to starve and freeze? Nearby farmers refused to help. Some were pacifists, Quakers and German sectarians, unwilling to support either side. Others looked out for their own families, selling grain for gold from British quartermasters, but refusing depreciated continental currency. Such a dearth of public spirit and want of public virtue, lamented Washington. By spring, more than 200 officers had resigned. 1,000 hungry soldiers had deserted, and another 3,000 had died from malnutrition and disease. That winter at Valley Forge took as many American lives as had 2 years of fighting. In this dark hour, Baron von Steuben raised the readiness of the American army. A former Prussian military officer, von Steuben was one of a handful of Republican-minded foreign aristocrats who joined the American cause. Appointed as Inspector General of the Continental Army, he instituted a strict drill system and encouraged officers to become more professional. Thanks to von Steuben, the smaller army that emerged from Valley Forge in the spring of 1778 was a much tougher and better disciplined force. The Path to Victory, 1778 to 1783. Wars are often won by astute diplomacy, and so it was with the War of Independence. The Patriots' prospects improved dramatically in 1778, when the Continental Congress concluded a military alliance with France, the most powerful nation in Europe. The alliance gave the Americans desperately needed money, supplies, and eventually troops, and it confronted Britain with an international war that challenged its domination of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The French Alliance. France and America were unlikely partners. France was Catholic and a monarchy. The United States was Protestant and a federation of republics. From 1689 to 1763, the two peoples had been enemies. New Englanders had brutally uprooted the French population from Acadia, Nova Scotia, in 1755, and the French and their Indian allies had raided British settlements. But the Comte de Vergennes, the French foreign minister, was determined to avenge the loss of Canada during the Great War for Empire, see Chapter 4, and persuaded King Louis XVI to provide the rebellious colonies with a secret loan and much-needed gunpowder. When news of the rebel victory at Saratoga reached Paris in December of 1777, the Vergennes sought a formal alliance. Benjamin Franklin and other American diplomats craftily exploited France's rivalry with Britain to win an explicit commitment to American independence. The Treaty of Alliance of February 1778 specified that once France entered the war, neither party would sign a separate peace without the liberty, sovereignty, and independence of the United States. In return, the Continental Congress agreed to recognize any French conquests in the West Indies. France and America warned Britain's Lord Stormont were indissolubly leagued for our destruction. The alliance gave new life to the Patriots' cause. There has been a great change in the state since the news of France, a patriot soldier reported from Pennsylvania. Farmers, mercenary wretches, he called them, were as eager for continental money now as they were for a few weeks ago for British gold. Its confidence bolstered, the Continental Congress addressed the demands of the officer corps. Most officers were gentlemen who equipped themselves and raised volunteers in return. They insisted on lifetime military pensions at half pay. John Adams condemned the officers for scrambling for rank and pay like apes for nuts, but General Washington urged the Congress to grant their pensions. The salvation of the cause depends upon it. The Congress reluctantly granted the officers half pay, but only for 7 years. Meanwhile, the war had become unpopular in Britain. At first, George III was determined to crush the rebellion. If America won independence, he warned, Lord North, the West Indies must follow them. Ireland would soon follow in the same plan and be a separate state. Then this island would be reduced to itself and soon would be a poor island indeed. Stunned by the defeat at Saratoga, however, the king changed his mind. To thwart an American alliance with France, he authorized North to seek a negotiated settlement. In February of 1778, North persuaded Parliament to repeal the tea and prohibitory acts, and amazingly renounced its power to tax the colonies. But the Patriots, now allied with France and committed to independence, rejected North's overture. Explain consequences. What were the most important results of the Patriot victory at Saratoga? Have students read the 1778 Treaty of Alliance, avalon.law.yale.edu, blah, blah, blah. All right, here we go. War in the South. The French alliance did not bring a rapid end to the war. When France entered the conflict in June of 1778, it hoped to seize all of Britain's sugar islands. Spain, which joined the war against Britain in 1779, aimed to regain Florida and the fortress of Gibraltar at the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. Britain's southern strategy. For its part, the British government revised its military strategy to defend the West Indies and capture the rich tobacco and rice-growing colonies, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Once conquered, the ministry planned to use the Scottish Highlanders in the Carolinas and other loyalists to hold them. It had already mobilized the Cherokees and Delawares against the land-hungry Americans and knew that the Patriots' fears of slave uprisings weakened them militarily. As South Carolina Patriots admitted to the Continental Congress, they could raise only a few recruits, by reason of a great proportion of citizens necessary to remain at home to prevent insurrection among the Negroes. The large number of slaves in the South made the Revolution a triangular war, in which African Americans constituted a strategic problem for patriots and a tempting, if dangerous, opportunity for the British. Britain actively recruited slaves to its cause. The effort began with Dunmore's controversial proclamation in November of 1775, recruiting slaves to his Ethiopian regiment. In 1779, the Philipsburg Proclamation declared that any slave who deserted a rebel master would receive protection, freedom, and land from Great Britain. Together, these proclamations led some 30,000 African Americans to take refuge behind British lines. George Washington initially barred blacks from the Continental Army, but he relented in 1777. By war's end, African Americans could enlist in every state but South Carolina and Georgia, and some 5,000 slave and free fought for the Patriot cause. Thinking like a Historian, page 192. It fell to Sir Henry Clinton, acutely aware of the role slaves might play, to implement Britain's southern strategy. From the British Army's main base in New York City, From the British Army's main base in New York City, Clinton launched a seaborne attack on Savannah, Georgia. Troops commanded by Colonel Archibald Campbell captured the town in December 1778. Mobilizing hundreds of blacks to transport supplies, Campbell moved inland and captured Augusta early in 1779. By year's end, Clinton's forces and local loyalists controlled coastal Georgia and had 10,000 troops poised for an assault on South Carolina. In 1780, British forces marched from victory to victory. In May, Clinton forced the surrender of Charleston, South Carolina, and its garrison of 5,000 troops. Then Lord Charles Cornwallis assumed control of the British forces and, at Camden, defeated an American force commanded by General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga. Only 1,200 Patriot militiamen joined Gates at Camden, a fifth of the number at Saratoga. Cornwallis took control of South Carolina, and hundreds of African Americans fled to freedom behind British lines. The Southern strategy was working. Then the tide of battle turned. Thanks to another Republican-minded European aristocrat, the Marquis de Lafayette, France finally dispatched troops to the American mainland. A longtime supporter of the American cause, Lafayette persuaded King Louis XVI to send General Comte de Rochambeau and 5,500 men to Newport, Rhode Island, in 1780. There, they threatened the British forces holding New York City. Map 6.3, Native Americans and the War in the West, 1778-79. Many Indian peoples remained neutral, but others, fearing land-hungry patriot farmers, used British-supplied guns to raid American settlements. To thwart attacks by militant Shawnees, Cherokees, and Delawares, a patriot militia led by George Rogers Clark captured the British fort and supply depot at Vincennes on the Wabash River in February of 1779. To the north, Patriot generals John Sullivan and James Clinton defeated the pro-British Indian forces near Tioga on the New York-Pennsylvania border in August of 1779, and then systematically destroyed villages and crops throughout the lands of the Iroquois. Guerrilla warfare in the Carolinas. Meanwhile, Washington dispatched General Nathanael Greene to capture the Carolinas, where he found a country that had been ravaged and plundered by both friends and enemies. Greene put local militiamen who had been without discipline and addicted to plundering under strong leaders and unleashed them on less mobile British forces. On October 1780, Patriot militia defeated a regiment of Loyalists at Kings Mountain, South Carolina, taking 1,000 prisoners. American guerrillas, commanded by the Swamp Fox, General Francis Marion, also won a series of small but fierce battles. Then, in January of 1781, General Daniel Morgan led an American force to a bloody victory at Cowpen, South Carolina. In March, Greene's soldiers fought Cornwallis's seasoned army to a draw at North Carolina's Gulliford Courthouse. Weakened by this war of attrition, the British general decided to concede the Carolinas to Greene and seek a decisive victory in Virginia. There, many Patriot militiamen had refused to take up arms, claiming that the rich wanted the poor to fight for them. Exploiting these social divisions, Cornwallis moved easily through the Tidewater region of Virginia in early summer of 1781. Reinforcements sent from New York and commanded by General Benedict Arnold, the infamous Patriot traitor, bolstered his ranks. As Arnold and Cornwallis sparred with an American force led by Lafayette near the York Peninsula, Washington was informed that France had finally sent its powerful West Indian fleet to North America, and he devised an audacious plan. Feigning an assault on New York City, he secretly marched General Rochambeau's army from Rhode Island to Virginia. Simultaneously, the French fleet took control of the Chesapeake Bay. By the time the British discovered Washington's scheme, Cornwallis was surrounded. His 9,500-man army outnumbered 2 to 1 on land and cut off from reinforcement or retreat by sea. It was in a hopeless position. Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in October of 1781. The Franco-American victory broke the resolve of the British government. "Oh God, it is all over," Lord North exclaimed. Isolated diplomatically in Europe, stymied militarily in America, and lacking public support at home, the British ministry gave up active prosecution of the war on the American mainland. The Patriot Advantage. How could mighty Britain, victorious in the Great War identify causes. What were the keys to the Patriot victory in the South? The Patriot Advantage. How could mighty Britain, victorious in the Great War for Empire, lose to a motley rebel army? The British ministry pointed to a series of blunders by the military leadership. Why had Howe not ruthlessly pursued Washington's army in 1776? Why had Howe and Burgoyne failed to coordinate their attacks in 1777? Why had Cornwallis marched deep into the Patriot-dominated state of Virginia in 1781? Historians acknowledge British mistakes, but they also attribute the rebels' victory to French aid and the inspired leadership of George Washington. Astutely deferring to elected officials, Washington won the support of the Continental Congress and state governments. Confident of his military abilities, he pursued a defensive strategy that minimized casualties and maintained the morals of his officers and soldiers throughout 5 difficult years of war. Moreover, the Patriots' control of local governments gave Washington a greater margin for error than British generals had. Local militiamen provided the edge in the 1777 victory at Saratoga and forced Cornwallis from the Carolinas in 1781. Trace change over time. Despite being at a clear disadvantage at the start of the war, the American Patriots won. Why? In the end, it was the American people who decided the outcome, especially the 1/3 of the white colonists who were zealous patriots. Tens of thousands of these farmers and artisans accepted Continental bills in payment for supplies, and thousands of soldiers took them as pay even as the currency literally depreciated in their pockets. Rampant inflation meant that every paper dollar held for a week lost value, imposing a hidden currency tax on those who accepted the paper currency. Each individual tax was small, a few pennies on each dollar, but as millions of dollars changed hands multiple times and the currency tax paid by ordinary citizens financed the American military victory. Teaching tip: AP framework requires that students know why the Patriot cause succeeded. The question of why the Patriots achieved independence in the face of a seemingly much stronger Great Britain offers a fascinating opportunity for discussion. Students can be asked to engage in a debate or class discussion on the following topic: British mistakes led to American independence more than Patriot advantages. Teaching tip: students can get a greater sense of the Treaty of Paris and its territorial dimensions by viewing the interactive map that is part of the Excitement lesson on Ending the War, 1783. Exam alert. The 2010 AP U.S. History exam asked students to analyze the political, diplomatic, and military reasons for the U.S. victory in the Revolutionary War. Diplomatic triumph. After Yorktown, diplomats took 2 years to conclude a peace treaty. Talks began in Paris in April of 1782, but the French and Spanish, still hoping to seize a West Indian island or Gibraltar, stalled for time. Their tactics infuriated American diplomats, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. So the Americans negotiated secretly with the British, prepared, if necessary, to ignore the Treaty of Alliance and sign a separate peace. British ministers were equally eager. Parliament wanted peace, and they feared the loss of a rich sugar island. Consequently, the American diplomats secured extremely favorable terms in the Treaty of Paris, signed in September of 1783. Great Britain formally recognized American independence and relinquished its claims to land south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River. The British negotiators did not insist on a separate territory for their Indian allies. In endeavoring to assist you, a wee Indian complained to a British general, "It seems we have wrought our own ruin." The Cherokees were forced to relinquish claims to 5 million acres, 3/4 of their territory, in treaties with Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia, while New York and the Continental Congress pressed the Iroquois and Ohio Indians to cede much of their land as well. British officials, like those of the early modern empires, found it easy to abandon allies they had never really understood. America compared. The Paris treaty also granted Americans fishing rights off of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, prohibited the British from carrying away any Negroes or other property, and guaranteed freedom of navigation on the Mississippi to American citizens forever. In return, the American government allowed British merchants to pursue legal claims for pre-war debts and encouraged the state legislatures to return confiscated property to Loyalists and grant them citizenship. In the Treaty of Versailles, signed simultaneously, Britain made peace with France and Spain. Neither American ally gained very much. Spain reclaimed Florida from Britain, but not the strategic fortress at Gibraltar. France received the Caribbean island of Tobago, small consolation for a war that had sharply raised taxes and quadrupled France's national debt. Just 6 years later, cries for tax relief and political liberty would spark the French Revolution. Only Americans profited handsomely. The treaties gave them their independence and access to the Trans-Appalachian West. Historians have debated the degree to which the American Revolution was a truly democratic movement. An important book on the topic is Gordon S. Wood, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, 1992. Creating Republican Institutions, 1776 to 1787. When the Patriots declared independence, they confronted the issue of political authority. Which of us shall be the rulers? Asked a Philadelphia newspaper. The question was multifaceted. Would power reside in the national government or the states? Who would control the new Republican institutions, traditional elites or average citizens? Would women have greater political and legal rights? What would be the status of the slaves in the new republic? State constitutions. How much democracy? In May of 1776, the Second Continental Congress urged Americans to reject royal authority and establish republican governments. Most states quickly complied. Constitutions employ every pen, an observer noted. Within 6 months, Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania had all ratified the new constitutions, and Connecticut and Rhode Island had revised their colonial charters to delete references to the king. Republicanism meant more than ousting the king. The Declaration of Independence stated the principle of popular sovereignty governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. In the heat of revolution, many patriots gave this clause a further democratic twist. In North Carolina, the backcountry farmers of Mecklenburg County told their delegates to the state's constitutional convention to oppose everything that leans to aristocracy or power in the hands of the rich. In Virginia, voters elected a new assembly in 1776 that an eyewitness remarked was composed of men not quite so well-dressed, nor so politely educated, nor so highly born as colonial-era legislatures. Pennsylvania's controversial constitution. This democratic impulse flowered in Pennsylvania, thanks to a coalition of Scots-Irish farmers, Philadelphia artisans, and Enlightenment-influenced intellectuals. In 1776, these insurgents ousted every officeholder of the Penn's family. Penn family's proprietary government, abolished property ownership as a qualification for voting, and granted all tax-paying men the right to vote and hold office. The Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 also created a unicameral one-house legislature with complete power. There was no governor to exercise a vote. Other provisions mandated a system of elementary education and protected citizens from imprisonment for debt. Pennsylvania's Democratic Constitution alarmed many leading patriots. From Boston, John Adams denounced the unicameral legislature as so democratical that it must produce confusion and every evil work. Along with other conservative patriots, Adams wanted to restrict office holding to men of learning and easy circumstances, and warned of oppression under majority rule. If you give ordinary citizens the command or preponderance in the legislature, they will vote all property out of the hands of you aristocrats. Compare and contrast. What aspects of Pennsylvania's Constitution were most objectionable to Adams, and what did he advocate instead? To counter the appeal of the Pennsylvania Constitution, Adams published Thoughts on Government 1776. In that treaty, he adapted the British Whig theory of mixed government, a sharing of power among the monarch, the House of Lords, and the Commons, to a republican society. To disperse authority and preserve liberty, he insisted on separate institutions. Legislatures would make laws, the executive would administer them, and the judiciary would enforce them. Adams also demanded a bicameral two-house legislature with an upper house of substantial property owners to offset the popular majorities in the lower one. As further curbs on democracy, he proposed an elected governor with veto power and appointed not elected judiciary. Conservative patriots endorsed Adams's governmental system. In New York's Constitution of 1777, property qualifications for voting excluded 20% of white men from assembly elections and 60% from casting ballots for the governor and the upper house. In South Carolina, elite planters used property rules to disqualify about 90% of white men from office holding. The 1778 Constitution required candidates for governor to have a debt-free estate of £10,000, about $700,000 today, senators to be worth £2,000, and assemblymen to own property valued at £1,000. Even in traditionally democratic Massachusetts, the 1780 Constitution, authored primarily by Adams, raised property qualifications for voting and office holding and skewed the lower house toward Eastern mercantile interests. The political legacy of the Revolution was complex. Only in Pennsylvania and Vermont were radical patriots able to create truly democratic institutions. Yet in all the new state representative legislatures had acquired more power, and average citizens now had greater power at the polls and greater influence in the halls of government. Women seek a public voice. Women seek a public voice. The extraordinary excitement of the Revolutionary era tested the dictum that only men could engage in politics. Men controlled all public institutions, legislatures, juries, government offices, but upper-class women engaged in political debate and, defying men's scorn, filled their letters, diaries, and conversations with opinions on public issues. The men say we have no business with politics. Eliza Wilkinson of South Carolina complained in 1783, they won't even allow us liberty of thought, and that is all I want. As Wilkinson's remark suggests, most women did not insist on civic equality with men. Many sought only an end to restrictive customs and laws. Abigail Adams demanded equal legal rights for married women who, under common law, could not own property, enter into contracts, or initiate lawsuits. The war bonds she purchased had to be held in a trust run by a male relative. Men would be tyrants if they continued to hold such power over women, Adams declared to her husband, John, criticizing him and other patriots for emancipating all nations from monarchical despotism while retaining absolute power over wives. Most politicians ignored women's requests, and most men insisted on traditional sexual and political prerogatives. Long-married husbands remained patriarchs who dominated their households, and even young men who embraced the Republican ideal of a companionate marriage did not support legal equality for wives and daughters, except in New Jersey, which until 1807 allowed unmarried and widowed female property holders to vote. Women remained disenfranchised. In the new American Republic, only white men enjoyed full citizenship. Nevertheless, the Republican belief in an educated citizenry created opportunities for some women. In her 1779 essay, The Equality of the Sexes, Judith Sargent Murray argued that men and women had equal capacities for memory, that women had superior imaginations. She conceded that most women were inferior to men in judgment and reasoning, but only from the lack of training. We can only reason from what we know, she argued, and most women had been denied the opportunity of acquiring knowledge. That situation changed in the 1790s when the Attorney General of Massachusetts declared that girls had an equal right to schooling under the state constitution. By 1850, the literacy rate of women and men in the northeastern states were equal, and educated women again challenged their subordinate legal and political status. The war's losers: Loyalists, Native Americans, and slaves. The success of Republican institutions was assisted by the departure of as many as 100,000 Loyalists, many of whom suffered severe financial losses. Some patriots demanded revolutionary justice, the seizure of all Loyalist property, and its distribution to needy Americans, but most officials were unwilling to go so far. When state governments did seize Loyalist property, they often auctioned it to the highest bidders. Only rarely did small-scale farmers benefit. In the cities, patriot merchants replaced loyalists at the top of the economic ladder, supplanting a traditional economic elite who often invested profits from trade in real estate with Republican entrepreneurs who tended to promote new trading ventures and domestic manufacturing. This shift facilitated America's economic development in the years to come. Identify causes. What impacted Republican ideals have on gender roles and expectations during the Revolutionary Era? Judith Sargent Murray. Judith Sargent Murray was perhaps the most accomplished female essayist of the Revolutionary Era. Publishing under various pen names, she advocated for economic independence and better educational opportunities for women. 2 years before Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, she published On the Equality of the Sexes in the Massachusetts Magazine. Her letter books, which run to 20 volumes, were discovered only in 1984. The Judith Sargent Murray Society, JSM Society, is now transcribing and indexing them for publication. This striking portrait by John Singleton Copley hints at her intelligence and sardonic wit. Anyways, back to the losers of the Revolution. Explain consequences. How did the revolutionary commitment to liberty and the protection of property affect enslaved African Americans and Western Indians? Though the revolution did not result in widespread property redistribution, it did encourage human middling planters and small-time entrepreneurs to believe that their new Republican governments would protect their property and ensure widespread access to land. In Western counties, former regulators demanded that the new governments be more responsive to their needs. Beyond the Appalachians, thousands of squatters who had occupied lands in Kentucky and Tennessee expected their claims to be recognized and lands to be made available on easy terms. If the United States were to secure the loyalty of Westerners, it would have to meet their needs more effectively than the British Empire had. This meant, among other things, extinguishing Native American claims to land as quickly as possible. At war's end, George Washington commented on the rage for speculating in the Ohio Valley lands. Men in these times talk with such facility of 50 and 100 and even 500,000 acres as a gentleman formerly would do of 100 acres. If we make a right use of our natural advantages, a 4th of July orator observed, we soon must be a truly great and happy people. Native American land claims stood as a conspicuous barrier to the natural advantages he imagined. For Southern slaveholders, the Revolution was fought to protect property rights, and any sentiment favoring slave emancipation met with violent objections. When Virginia Methodists called for a general emancipation in 1785, slaveholders used revolutionary principles to defend their right to human property. They risked their lives and fortunes and waded through the seas of blood to secure the possession of their rights of liberty and property, only to hear of a very subtle and daring attempt to dispossess us of a very important part of our property. Emancipation would bring want, poverty, distress, and ruin to the free citizen. The liberties coveted by ordinary white Americans bore hard on the interests of Native Americans and slaves. The Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation. As patriots embraced the independence in 1776, they envisioned a central government with limited powers. Carter Braxton of Virginia thought the Continental Congress should regulate the affairs of trade, war, peace, alliances, etc., but should by no means have the authority to interfere with the internal police, governance, or domestic concerns of any colony. That idea informed the Articles of Confederation, which were approved by the Continental Congress in November of 1777. The Articles provided for a loose union in which each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence. As an association of equals, each state had one vote, regardless of its size, population, or wealth. Important laws needed the approval of 9 of the 13 states, and changes to the Articles required a unanimous consent. Though the Confederation had significant powers on paper, it could declare war, make treaties with foreign nations, adjudicate disputes between states, borrow and print money, and requisition funds from the states for the common defense or general welfare. It had major weaknesses as well. It had neither a chief executive nor a judiciary, though it could make treaties. It could not enforce their provisions since the states remained sovereign. Most important, it lacked the power to tax either the states or the people. Although the Congress exercised authority from 1776, raising the Continental Army, negotiating the treaty with France, and financing the war, the Articles won formal ratification only in 1781. The delay stemmed from conflicts over Western lands. The royal charters of Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and other states set boundaries stretching to the Pacific Ocean. States without Western lands, Maryland and Pennsylvania, refused to accept the Articles until the land-rich states relinquished these claims to the Confederation. Threatened by Cornwallis's army in 1781, Virginia gave up its claims, and Maryland, the last holdout, finally ratified the Articles, map 6.5. Continuing fiscal crisis. By 1780, the central government was nearly bankrupt, and General Washington called urgently for a national tax system. Without one, he warned, our cause is lost. Led by Robert Morris, who became superintendent of finance in 1781, nationalist-minded patriots tried to expand the Confederation's authority. They persuaded Congress to charter the Bank of North America, a private institution in Philadelphia, arguing that its notes would stabilize the inflated continental currency. Morris also created a central bureaucracy to manage the Confederation's finances and urged Congress to enact a 5% import tax. Rhode Island and New York rejected the tax proposal. His state had opposed British import duties. New York's representatives declared, and it would not accept them from Congress. To raise revenue, Congress looked to the sale of Western lands. In 1783, it asserted that the recently signed Treaty of Paris had extinguished the Indians' rights to those lands and made them the property of the United States. The Northwest Ordinance. By 1784, more than 30,000 settlers had already moved to Kentucky and Tennessee. Despite the uncertainties of frontier warfare, and after the war, their numbers grew rapidly. In that year, the residents of what is now eastern Tennessee organized a new state and called it Franklin, and sought admission to the Confederation. To preserve its authority over the West, Congress refused to recognize Franklin. Subsequently, Congress created the Southwest and Mississippi Territories, the future states of Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi, from lands ceded by North Carolina and Georgia. Because these cessions carried the stipulation that no regulation shall tend to emancipate slaves, these states and all those south of the Ohio River allowed human bondage. However, the Confederation Congress banned slavery north of the Ohio River. Between 1784 and 1787, it issued three important ordinances organizing the Old Northwest. The Ordinance of 1784, written by Thomas Jefferson, established the principle that territories could become states as their populations grew. The Land Ordinance of 1785 mandated a rectangular grid system of surveying and specified a minimum price of $1 an acre. It also required that half of the townships be sold in a single block of 23,000 acres each, which only large-scale speculators could afford, and the rest of the parcels of 640 acres, each which restricted their sale to well-to-do farmers. Finally, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 created the territories that would eventually become the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The ordinance prohibited slavery and earmarked funds from land sales for the support of schools. It also specified that Congress would appoint a governor and judges to administer each new territory until the population reached 5,000 free adult men, at which point the citizens could elect a territorial legislature. When the population reached 60,000, the legislature could devise a Republican constitution and apply to join the Confederation. The land ordinances of the 1780s were a great and enduring achievement of the Confederation Congress. They provided for orderly settlement and the admission of new states on the basis of equality. There would be no politically independent colonies in the West, but they also extended the geographical division between slave and free areas that would haunt the nation in the coming decades, and they implicitly invalidated Native American claims to an enormous swath of territory, a corollary that would soon lead to the newly independent nation once again into war. Shays' Rebellion. Though many national leaders were optimistic about the long-term prospects of the United States, post-war economic conditions were grim. The Revolution had crippled American shipping, cut exports of tobacco, rice, and wheat. The British Navigation Acts, which had nurtured colonial commerce, now barred Americans from legal trade with the British West Indies. Moreover, low-priced British manufacturers, and some from India as well, were flooding American markets, driving urban artisans and wartime textile firms out of business. I'll back up the question, compare and contrast. In what ways did the Confederation function effectively, and what were its greatest failings? The fiscal condition of the state governments was dire, primarily because of war debts. Well-to-do merchants and landowners, including Abigail Adams, had invested in state bonds during the war. Others had speculated in debt certificates, buying them on the cheap from hard-pressed farmers and soldiers. Now, creditors and speculators demanded that the state governments redeem the bonds and certificates quickly and at full value, a policy that would require tax increases and a decrease in the amount of paper currency. Most legislatures, now including a substantial number of middling farmers and artisans, refused. Instead, they authorized new issues of paper currency and allowed debtors to pay private creditors in installments. Although wealthy men deplored these measures as intoxicating draughts of liberty and that destroyed the just rights of creditors, such political intervention prevented social upheaval. In Massachusetts, however, the new Constitution placed power in the hands of a mercantile elite that owned the bulk of the state's war bonds. Ignoring the interests of ordinary citizens, the legislatures increased taxes fivefold to pay off wartime debts, and it stipulated that they be paid in hard currency. Even for substantial farmers, this was a crushing burden. When cash-strapped farmers could not pay both their taxes and their debts, creditors threatened lawsuits. Debtor Ephraim Wetmore heard a rumor that a merchant, Stephen Salisbury, would have my body dead or alive in case I did not pay. To protect their livelihoods, farmers called extra-legal conventions to protest high taxes and property seizures. Then mobs of angry farmers, including men of high status, closed the courts by force. I had no intentions to destroy the public government, declared Captain Adam Wheeler, a former town selectman. His goal was simply to prevent valuable and industrious members of society from being dragged from their families to prison because of their debts. These crowd actions grew into a full-scale revolt led by Captain Daniel Shays, a Continental Army veteran. As a revolt against taxes imposed by an unresponsive government, Shays' rebellion resembled American resistance to the British Stamp Act. Consciously linking themselves to the Patriot movement, Shays' men placed pine twigs in their hats, just as Continental troops had done. The people have turned against their teachers and doctrines which were inculcated to effect the late revolution, complained Fisher Ames, a conservative Massachusetts lawmaker. Some of the radical patriots of 1776 likewise condemned the Shayites, men who would lessen the weight of the government, lawfully exercised, must be enemies to our happy revolution and common liberty, charged Samuel Adams. To put down the rebellion, the Massachusetts legislature passed the Riot Act, and wealthy bondholders equipped a formidable fighting force, which Governor James Bowdoin used to disperse Shays' ragtag army during the winter of 1786 to 87. Although Shays' rebellion failed, it showed place events in context. How did Shayites draw on the revolution for inspiration? Although Shays' rebellion failed, it showed that many middling patriot families felt that American oppressors had replaced British tyrants. Massachusetts voters turned against Governor Bowdoin out of office, and debt-ridden farmers in New York, northern Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and New Hampshire closed courthouses and forced their governments to provide economic relief. British officials in Canada predicted the imminent demise of the United States, and American leaders urged purposeful action to save their Republican experiment. Events in Massachusetts, declared nationalist Henry Knox, formed the strongest argument possible for the creation of a strong general government. Constitution of 1787. These issues ultimately led to the drafting of a national constitution. From its creation, the U.S. Constitution was a controversial document, both acclaimed for solving the nation's woes and condemned for perverting its Republican principles. Critics charged that Republican institutions worked only in small political units, the states. Advocates replied that the Constitution extended republicanism by adding another level of government, elected by the people. In the new two-level political federation created by the Constitution, the national government would exercise limited delegated powers, and the existing state governments would retain authority over all other matters. The rise of the nationalist faction. Money questions, debts, taxes, and tariffs dominated the post-war political agenda. Americans who had served the Confederation as military officers, officials, and diplomats viewed these issues from a national perspective and advocated a stronger central government. George Washington, Robert Morris, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams wanted Congress to control foreign and interstate commerce and tariff policy. However, lawmakers in Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, states with strong commercial traditions, insisted on controlling their own tariffs, both to protect their artisans from low-cost imports and to assist their merchants. Most southern states opposed tariffs because planters wanted to import British textiles and ironware at the lowest possible prices. Nonetheless, some southern leaders became nationalists because their state legislatures had cut taxes and refused to redeem state war bonds. Such policies lamented wealthy bondholders. Charles Lee of Virginia led taxpayers to believe they would never be compelled to pay the public debt. Creditors also condemned state laws that stayed or delayed the payment of mortgages and other private debts. While men are madly accumulating enormous debts, their legislatures are making provisions for their non-payment, complained a South Carolina merchant. To undercut the Democratic majorities in the state legislatures, creditors joined the movement for a stronger central government. Spurred on by Shays' Rebellion, nationalists in Congress secured a resolution calling for a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Only an efficient plan from the convention, a fellow nationalist wrote to James Madison, can prevent anarchy first and civil convulsions afterwards. The Philadelphia Convention. In May of 1787, 55 delegates arrived in Philadelphia. They came from every state except Rhode Island, where the legislature opposed increasing central authority. Most were strong nationalists. 42 had served in the Confederation Congress. They were also educated and propertied, merchants, slaveholding planters, and moneyed men. There were no artisans, backcountry settlers, or tenants, and only a single human farmer. Some influential patriots missed the convention. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were serving as American ministers to Britain and France, respectively. The Massachusetts General Court rejected Sam Adams as a delegate because he opposed a stronger national government, and his fellow firebrand of Virginia, Patrick Henry, refused to attend because he, quote, smelt a rat. The absence of experienced leaders and contrary-minded delegates allowed capable young nationalists to set the agenda. Declaring that the convention would decide forever the fate of the Republican government, James Madison insisted on increasing national authority. Alexander Hamilton of New York likewise demanded a strong central government to protect the Republic from the imprudence of democracy. Virginia and New Jersey plans. The delegates elected George Washington as their presiding officer and voted to meet behind closed doors. Then, momentously, they decided not to revise the Articles of Confederation, but rather to consider the so-called Virginia Plan, a scheme for a powerful national government devised by James Madison. Just 36 years old, Madison was determined to fashion national political institutions run by men of high character. A graduate of Princeton, he had read classical and modern political theory and served in both the Confederation Congress and the Virginia Assembly. Once an optimistic patriot, Madison had grown discouraged because of the narrow ambition and outlook of state legislators. Madison's Virginia plan differed from the Articles of Confederation in three crucial respects. First, the plan rejected state sovereignty in favor of the supremacy of the national authority, including the power to overturn state laws. Secondly, it called for the national government to be established by the people, not the states, and for national laws to operate directly on citizens of the various states. Third, the plan proposed a three-tier election system in which ordinary voters would elect only the lower house of the national legislature. This lower house would then select the upper house, and both houses would appoint the executive and judiciary. From a political perspective, Madison's plan had two fatal flaws. First, most state politicians and citizens resolutely opposed allowing the national government to veto state laws. Second, the plan based representation in the lower house on population. This provision, a Delaware delegate warned, would allow the populous states to crush the small ones whenever they stand in the way of their ambitious or interested views. So delegates from Delaware and other small states rallied behind a plan devised by William Paterson of New Jersey. The New Jersey Plan gave the Confederation the power to raise revenue, control commerce, and make binding requisitions on the states, but it preserved the states' control of their own laws and guaranteed their equality as in the Confederation Congress. Each state would have one vote in a unicameral legislature. Delegates from the populous states vigorously opposed this provision. After a month-long debate on the two plans, a bare majority of the states agreed to use Madison's Virginia plan as a basis of discussion. This decision raised the odds that the convention would create a more powerful national government. Outraged by this prospect, two New York delegates, Robert Yates and John Lansing, accused their colleagues of exceeding their mandate to revise the articles and left the convention. The remaining delegates met 6 days a week during the summer of 1787, debating both high principles and practical details. Experienced politicians, they looked for a plan that would be acceptable to most citizens and existing political interests. Pierce Butler of South Carolina invoked a classical Greek precedent. We must follow the example of Solon, who gave the Athenians not the best government he could devise, but the best they would receive. The Great Compromise. As the convention grappled with the central problem of representation, large and small states, the Connecticut delegates suggested a possible solution. They proposed that the national legislature's upper chamber, the Senate, have 2 members from each state, while seats in the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, be apportioned by the population, determined every 10 years by a national census. After bitter debate, delegates from the populous states reluctantly accepted this great compromise. Other state-related issues were quickly settled by restricting or leaving ambiguous the extent of central authority. Some delegates opposed a national system of courts, predicting that the states will revolt at such encroachments on the judicial authority. This danger led the convention to vest the judicial power in one Supreme Court and allow the new national legislature to decide whether to establish lower courts within the states. The convention also refused to set a property requirement for voting in national elections. 8 or 9 states have extended the right of suffrage beyond the freeholders. George Mason of Virginia pointed out, "What will people there say if they should be disenfranchised?" Finally, the convention specified that state legislatures would elect members of the upper house or Senate, and the states would select the electors who would choose the president. By allowing states to have important roles in the new constitutional system, the delegates hoped that their citizens would accept limits on state sovereignty. The shadow of slavery hovered over many debates, and Governor Morris of New York brought it into view. To safeguard property rights, Morris wanted life terms for senators, a property qualification for voting in national elections, and a strong president with veto power. Nonetheless, he rejected the legitimacy of 2 traditional types of property: the feudal dues claimed by aristocratic landowners and the ownership of slaves. An advocate of free markets and personal liberty, Morris condemned slavery as a nefarious institution. Many slave-owning delegates from the Chesapeake region, including Madison and George Mason, recognized that slavery contradicted Republican principles and hoped for its eventual demise. They supported an end to American participation in the Atlantic slave trade, a proposal the South Carolina and Georgia delegates angrily rejected. Unless the importation of African slaves continued, these rice planters and merchants declared their states, quote, "shall not be parties to the Union." At their insistence, the convention denied Congress the power to regulate immigration and so the slave trade until 1808. American Voices, page 208. The delegates devised other slavery-related compromises. To mollify Southern planters, they wrote a fugitive clause that allowed masters to reclaim enslaved blacks or white indentured servants who fled to other states. But in acknowledgement of the anti-slavery sentiments of Morris and other Northerners, the delegates excluded the words slavery and slave from the Constitution. It spoke only of citizens and all other persons. Because slaves lacked the vote, anti-slavery delegates wanted their census numbers excluded when appointing seats in Congress. Southerners, ironically given that they considered slaves property, demanded that slaves be counted in the census. The same full same full citizens to increase the South's representation. Ultimately, the delegates agreed that each slave would count as 3/5 of a free person for purposes of representation and taxation, a compromise that helped Southern planters dominate the national government until 1860. National authority. Having addressed the concerns of small states and slave states, the convention created a powerful national government. The Constitution declared that congressional legislation was the supreme law of the land. It gave the new government the power to tax, raise an army and a navy, and regulate foreign and interstate commerce, with the authority to make all laws necessary and proper, to implement those and other provisions, to assist creditors and establish the new government. Fiscal integrity of the Constitution required the United States to honor the existing national debt and prohibited the states from issuing paper money or enacting any laws impairing the obligation of contracts. The proposed Constitution was not a perfect production. Benjamin Franklin admitted as he urged the delegates to sign it in September of 1787, but the great statesman confessed his astonishment at finding this system approaching so near to perfection. His colleagues apparently agreed. All but 3 signed the document. The people debate ratification. The procedure for ratifying the new Constitution was as controversial as its contents. Knowing that Rhode Island and perhaps other states would reject it, the delegates did not submit the Constitution to the state legislatures for their unanimous consent as required by the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they arbitrarily and cleverly declared that it would take effect when ratified by conventions in 9 of the 13 states. As the constitutional debates began in early 1788, the Nationalists seized the initiative with 2 bold moves. First, they called themselves Federalists, suggesting that they supported a federal union, a loose, decentralized system, and obscuring their commitment to a strong national government. Second, they launched a coordinated campaign in pamphlets and newspapers to explain and justify the Philadelphia Constitution. The Anti-Federalists. The opponents of the Constitution, called by default the Anti-Federalists, had diverse backgrounds and motives. Some, like Governor George Clinton of New York, feared that state governments would lose power. Rural Democrats protested that the proposed document, unlike most state constitutions, lacked a declaration of individual rights. They also feared that the central government would be run by wealthy men. Lawyers and men of learning and moneyed men expect to be managers of the Constitution, worried a Massachusetts farmer. They will swallow up all of us like all of us little folks, just as the whale swallowed up Jonah. Giving political substance to those fears, Melecton Smith of New York argued that large electoral districts prescribed by the Constitution would restrict office holding to wealthy men, whereas smaller districts used in state elections usually produced legislatures composed principally of respectable yeomanry. John Quincy Adams agreed if only 8 men were to represent Massachusetts, they would infallibly be chosen from the aristocratic part of the community. John Quincy Adams, if only 8 men were to represent Massachusetts, they will infallibly be chosen from the aristocratic part of the community. Smith summed up the views of Americans who held traditional Republican values. To keep the government close to the people, they wanted the states to remain small, sovereign republics tied together only for trade and defense, not the United States, but the States United. Citing the French political philosopher Montesquieu, Anti-Federalists argued that the Republican institutions were best suited to small polities. No extensive empire can be governed on Republican principles, declared James Winthrop of Massachusetts. Patrick Henry worried that the Constitution would recreate British rule, high taxes, and an oppressive bureaucracy. A standing army and a great and mighty president, supported in extravagant munificence. As another anti-federalist put it, I had rather be a free citizen of the small republic of Massachusetts than an oppressed subject of the great American empire. Federalists respond. In New York, where ratification was hotly contested, James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton defended the proposed Constitution in a series of 85 essays written in 1787 and 1788, collectively titled The Federalist. This work influenced political leaders throughout the country and subsequently won acclaim as an important treatise of practical republicanism. Its authors denied that a centralized government would lead to domestic tyranny. Drawing on Montesquieu's theories and John Adams's thoughts on government, Madison, Jay, and Hamilton pointed
out that the authority would be divided among the president, bicameral legislature, and judiciary. Each branch of the government would check and balance the others, and so preserve liberty. In Federalist Number 10, Madison challenged the view that Republican governments only worked in small polities, arguing that a large state would better protect Republican liberty. It was sown into the nature of man, Madison wrote, for individuals to seek power and form factions. Indeed, a landed interest, a manufacturing interest, a mercantile interest, a moneyed interest, with many lesser interests, grow up of necessity in civilized nations. A free society should welcome all factions, but keep any one of them from becoming dominant, something best achieved in a large republic. Extend the sphere and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. Madison concluded, inhibiting the formation of a majority eager to invade the rights of other citizens. The Constitution ratified. The delegates debating these issues in the state ratification conventions included untutored farmers and middling artisans, as well as educated gentlemen. Generally backcountry delegates were anti-federalists, while those from coastal areas were federalists. In Pennsylvania, Philadelphia merchants and artisans joined commercial farmers to ratify the Constitution. Other early Federalist successes came in four less populous states: Delaware, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut, where delegates hoped that a strong national government would offset the power of large neighboring states, map 6.7. The Constitution's first real test came in January of 1788 in Massachusetts, a hotbed of anti-Federalist sentiment. Influential patriots, including Samuel Adams and Governor John Hancock, opposed the new Constitution, as did many followers of Daniel Shays. But Boston artisans who wanted tariff protections from British imports supported ratification. To win over other delegates, Federalist leaders assured the convention that they would recommend a national Bill of Rights. By a close vote of 187 to 168, the Federalists carried the day. Spring brought Federalist victories in Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire, reaching the 9-state quota required for ratification. But it took the powerful arguments advanced in the Federalist and more promises of a Bill of Rights to secure the Constitution's adoption in the essential states of Virginia and New York. The votes were again close, 89 to 79 in Virginia and 30 to 27 in New York. Testifying to their respect for popular sovereignty and majority rule, most Americans accepted the verdict of ratifying the conventions. A decided majority of the New Hampshire Assembly had opposed the new system, reported Joshua Atherton, but now they said it is adopted, so let us try it. In Virginia, Patrick Henry vowed to submit as a quiet citizen and fight for amendments in a constitutional way. Unlike in France, where the Revolution of 1789 divided society into irreconcilable factions for generations, the American Constitutional Revolution of 1787 created a national republic that enjoyed broad popular support. Federalists celebrated their triumph by organizing great processions in their seaport cities, by marching in orderly fashion in a conscious contrast to the riotous revolutionary mobs. Federalist-minded citizens affirmed their allegiance to the self-governing but elite-ruled Republican nation. Summary. In this chapter, we examined the unfolding of two related sets of events. The first was the war between Britain and its rebellious colonies that began in 1776 and ended in 1783. The two great battles of Saratoga, 1777, and Yorktown, 1781, determined the outcome of the conflict. Surprisingly, given the military might of the British Empire, both were American victories. These triumphs testify to the determination of George Washington, the resilience of the Continental Army, and the support for the patriot cause of hundreds of local militias and tens of thousands of tax-paying citizens. This popular support reflected the Patriots' second success, building effective institutions of Republican government. These elected institutions of local and state governance evolved out of colonial-era town meetings and representative assemblies. They were defined by the state constitutions written between 1776 and 1781, and their principles informed the first national constitution, the Articles of Confederation. Despite the challenges posed by the conflicts over suffrage, women's rights, and fiscal policy, these self-governing political institutions carried the new republic successfully through the war-torn era and laid the foundation for the Constitution of 1787, the national charter that endures today.